wasn't a Hollywood actor who had to show, like certain other conductors, how emotional he was. He didn't have to pat his shoulder blades. He lived for the service of music.
The fact that he used to do The Rite of Spring as a matter of course, and introduced Schoenberg, and did the British premiere of Wozzeck, and I mean really hair-raising material, which one would not at first glance associate with him, but he was great at it.
But the only thing you really noticed was in the fortissimo that his neck would swell. He used to sort of blow himself up in an extraordinary way, which made great tension.
He certainly had a terrific fire. No artist could possibly have got as far as he did in his career without that fire. And I think people found it very difficult to equate the fiery music that he produced with his very, very calm personality.
I first saw Sir Adrian conduct when I was only 15. I was determined to become a conductor, but at that time, just at the end of the war, there were no concerts really where I lived, and the concerts that I got to seemed to be conducted by people who waved themselves about in front of the orchestra. And I, like many laymen still, couldn't understand what they had to do with the music. And then my music master at school got me a pass for Maida Vale, the BBC Symphony Orchestra, rehearsed and conducted by Sir Adrian Boult. Relying on public transport, I got there a little late. I was ushered in to the back of the Maida Vale studio, and suddenly I knew what it was all about. This grey-haired man, seeming to me quite old even then, didn't move his feet at all. Just the stick was moving, an occasional nod of the head, an occasional lift and flick of the left hand, and yet everything he did came out in the sound of the orchestra. For me then, it was more like remembering how to conduct than learning how to conduct. Adrian Boult was born in Chester on April the 8th, 1889, at 1:55 a.m. precisely, and weighed 9 pounds, according to the diary kept by his mother Catherine. From the age of 8 months, he reacted to music in a very positive way.
He was evidently pained by loud music, although he did not mind a loud interlude. For instance, he took a Chopin impromptu quite placidly, but frowned or grunted if I began the Polonaise in A.
So his mother was an accomplished pianist, but she also had an interest in detail, both qualities inherited by Adrian. By 16 months, he could pick out tunes on the piano with one finger. Before he was 6, he surprised his parents by suddenly announcing that he wanted to play Tannhäuser on the orchestra, and was taken to his first orchestral concert at the Philharmonic Hall in Liverpool, in which Richter was conducting Tannhäuser.
He was most excited, not fidgety or noisy, but his eyes sparkled and his cheeks got so red. At the Tannhäuser overture, he gradually rose from his seat as it worked up, until, when the clash came, he sat down hard.
This same concert included Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony, of which the second movement is written in 5 beats in a bar. At first, Adrian was puzzled by this then unusual time signature, but soon got it right and was able to beat time with Richter. The rather sheltered provincial family life environment was shattered in 1901, when 12-year-old Adrian became a home boarder at Westminster School. Once over the initial shock of London, he indulged his passion for concert-going in a way he could never have done on Merseyside, and bought himself a season ticket for Henry Wood's Saturday-Sunday concerts.
Then came a thing described on the programme as Fantasy Overture Francesca da Rimini Tchaikovsky. They did not add, as they should have done, abbreviated version deranged by Henry J. Wood. I was furious.
That quotation comes from a very remarkable series of diaries which Adrian began in his early teens. Alongside the typical outbursts of youth, they already contain a passionate regard for matters of principle and a very mature, if outspoken, musical judgment.
I noticed an interesting thing about the balance of the orchestra. It contained 60 performers, and therefore less by about 30 than the Queen's Hall Orchestra, which loss, of course, was mainly felt in the string department, e.g. 2 double basses. Seeing the orchestra before the concert began, I said, "Now we shall have proper balance." But when I heard the orchestra, I was disappointed. The woodwind were heard evenly with the strings, but the brass was now too much for them. So I have now come to the conclusion that the woodwind parts must be doubled to get perfect balance.
The diaries also reveal his aims for the future.
Berlioz is marvellous. If I ever become a conductor, I must revive some of his works. Oh, if only I could.
He also made sketches of the orchestral layouts used by different conductors, a subject on which he had very strong ideas. You see, it was another matter of principle. The orchestra must be placed on the platform in such a way that every line and colour in a score could be realised, not in a way that looked nice or was convenient. The antiphonal give and take between first and second violins was the most obvious case in point. "Composers knew about stereo before we did," he used to say. "Don't people realise the composers up to the end of the First World War wrote for the orchestra in these positions? Why refuse them what they want?"
I think people like Richter and Toscanini would be turning in their graves if they thought we played with second violins on the left behind the firsts. It means that the second violins have got no individuality at all. And it also means, of course, that the whole of the treble of the string section goes to the left side, which after all affects stereo very seriously. I like to have the basses in the middle at the back, the firsts balancing the seconds, and then you have a balanced dish to offer your audience. And you'll find, I think, that even now, a good many composers would prefer it that way. It's only the conductors. It's easier for the conductor. It's easier for the players, of course. The second violins, they really needn't do any work at all through the whole concert. They just sit placidly and shelter behind the firsts.
In the early days, his response to British music was often lukewarm, particularly his attitude to Elgar.
24th of October, 1904. I was very disappointed. It is a very aimless wandering. Will Elgar live? His variations enigma will, I'm certain. Will Gerontius? I'm not certain by any means. Parts of it are wildly exciting, but a lot is deadly dull.
His most damning comment came 4 years later.
The better done I hear Elgar, the worse I like him.
But his belief that a conductor was a professional man who must do well what was put in front of him, coupled with an intense patriotism, made sure that he did his duty with regard to British music, a duty that became a love. In October 1908, when he was 19, Adrian Boult came up to Christchurch, Oxford, to read history. He told the dean at the time that he was going to be a conductor and had to go on to explain he meant a conductor of orchestras. Many years later, in the late 50s in fact, he was rehearsing the LPO here, and I came back to Oxford to hear the concert. In between the rehearsal and the concert, we were walking about together in the city, and he said to me, "You know, if we," which was characteristically generous of him, "manage to do anything special, it won't be because of our talent or good luck. It will be because of the principle of disinterest that we learned here." In 1912, when he went to the Leipzig Conservatory, he persuaded the authorities to allow him into the conducting class after only 6 weeks instead of the regulation 2 years. Here he studied Arthur Nikisch, whose magnetic personality and hypnotic power over the orchestra had first fascinated him at the age of 13. There is no doubt that Boult modelled himself on Nikisch as far as actual technique is concerned. In fact, he once said to me that when he returned from Leipzig, he was a carbon copy of Nikisch.
I did watch Nikisch very carefully, and I realized that he was inherently a very lazy man, as I am, and I saw that he was doing an enormous amount, far more with his fingers than most conductors do at all, because many conductors, as you know, have their fingers and wrists pretty stiff as they work. Mm-hmm. But and work it all from the elbow, that sort of way. But Nikisch was doing it with his fingers, and the result was the stick was a much more lively thing, much more expressive thing. And it was said at that time that Nikisch, if you shut him up in a glass box and told him to conduct 10 bars of anything, you could tell at the end of the 10 bars what he was conducting.
You may not know the piece that Sir Adrian is conducting here, but it's a wonderful example of his economy of gesture and yet concentration. Every movement he makes, whether it is with the stick or the hand or just the eyelids, is there for the players. He is not mirroring his emotions, but allowing them to project the music. Let's watch that little passage from Holst's Perfect Fool ballet music again, this time with the music.
He said, "Oh, young man, you work much too hard, you see. You've got to do it all with your stick, and you've got to throw the juice over the orchestra with the stick." I never forget that, rather ungentlemanly expression. What he meant was you've got to actually project what you think and what you feel, and it's no use keeping it to yourself and getting into a steam, because nobody's getting anything out of it at all. You've got to get it out there, and that is the problem, and that's why one uses an implement.
Now, most modern conductors work entirely on their elbows, and their wrists and fingers are quite stiff. Some of them work with their wrists, but many of them don't work with anything but the elbow. And you can hear the elbow if you switch on a loudspeaker and hear them over wireless. You will know that they're conducting with their elbows and not with the point of the stick. Because what I try and aim at is what I'm trying to teach any of the young people who have the patience to listen to me. that if you keep those two fingers a little apart, you can pivot in every way. You can work the whole thing without moving a wrist at all, even. And you bring the wrist in when you need a wider sweep. But that is the crux of the whole thing.
He would use his left hand very little, only for expression. He would never conduct in this sort of mirror image way. And if he was conducting gently, the stick would sort of gently float in the air. And then when he did want the orchestra to explode into a climax, he would give a flick across his shoulders like that, rather like casting a fly in fishing, and the whole orchestra would explode. It was wonderful.
It was alien to me, but it certainly did the trick, you know, that whole of never moving anything and rolling that funny ball at the end of his baton. But it was effortless, and again, you know, it wasn't, there were no amazing 7/8 and 14/16s and things like that, flicks of the wrist, but it was eminently clear, and he figured he knew what he was doing. He figured the orchestra knew what it was doing. So therefore, let's just not stop.
We're always doing too much, and we're always saying too much. We all talk too much at rehearsals, and we all do too much performances. Our musicians are just as competent musicians as we are, many of them, and we ought to trust them more.
When the concert that we are watching was recorded, Sir Adrian was not in the best of health, and so he had asked me to prepare the orchestra for him. One of the things I noticed immediately when he stepped up to conduct was that he got a much more beautiful line, much more legato and smooth playing straight away. My terribly clear beats had caused what he would call bumps.
I don't think many people realise how powerful the power of the eye can be with a conductor. I mean, some of them can look at you without making any sort of additional gesture at all, and you know exactly what's in there, what they want, and give it.
I felt his eyes always, because, I mean, he did look at you. He wasn't just looking around, it would be you. He was looking at us, and if you got a cue, it was direct. And because they were terrific eyes. Pictures of him when he was a child, even, you still see those eyes. You can still see Adrian there.
On the 27th of February 1914, the 24-year-old Adrian made his conducting debut with the professional orchestra, a mixture of Halle and Liverpool Philharmonic players at the Public Hall, West Kirby, near Birkenhead. The concert included the first performance of Butterworth's The Banks of Green Willow and another rarity, Wolf's Italian Serenade. An incident during the rehearsal of this piece is a foretaste of things to come, not to mention a sublime self-confidence in his own knowledge of the score, not by any means the easiest work for an inexperienced conductor. The first oboe, Charles Reynolds, was on loan from the Halle, and he came in a bar late. Boult pointed this out, but Reynolds said he knew the piece well and that his entry had been correct.
I'm afraid I knew very well that the piece had hardly ever been played in England before, so I thought the appropriate answer was, "I'm sorry, Mr. Reynolds, we must all of us have been a bar early then."
Later the same year, Britain declared war on Germany. With a medical category of C3 due to heart trouble, he was rejected for active service, but spent several hours each day drilling army recruits at West Kirby. Good training for an orchestral conductor?
Act 3, Scene 1, please. Now, don't tell me you don't know that. Come on. No! There. Act 3, Scene 1. Look at it.
So you'd open the score like that and start right away, crash. And nothing would happen at all. We had no idea. Then he would just say, Elgar 1, first bar, and then start conducting.
Come along,
or whatever
you
it was.
geese, you geese. Yes.
The end of the war brought Boult the greatest challenge yet to his musicianship and his ability to deal with people, in this case, the fiery impresario Diaghilev and his Russian ballet. Probably the success of the premiere of Gustav Holst's Planet Suite, set up in a great hurry the previous autumn, led to this unexpected engagement. He found himself taking over at only 4 days' notice a repertory of 14 ballets, none of which he knew except as a member of the audience. They included Petrushka, Firebird, La Boutique Fantasque, The Three-Cornered Hat, and Satie's Parade. After 4 weeks, the young conductor had seen no sign of the 20 guineas weekly agreed as his salary.
So I went to my room one evening after the second ballet, there were always 3, and sent a message to the great man, Diaghilev, to say that I was shortly going home, but that if he wanted me to conduct his 3rd ballet, I must have some money first. Round he came, with his pockets bulging with £20 notes, and asked me what I wanted.
Hardly the behaviour of our fine old English gentleman. In fact, he found that he had to have a row with Diaghilev about once a fortnight. But he loved conducting the ballet, wanted to conduct it at different periods throughout his life, and in fact, his last public appearance at the age of 89 was to conduct a performance of Elgar's Sanguine Fan for the London Festival Ballet.
When he conducted it, it was quite different. The pace seemed to be different. The accents, in a way, were different. They seemed to come to more crescendo. They built up. The climaxes seemed to be greater, and the quieter moments quieter, without exaggeration. It's almost as if he had written the music himself. I often think that when a composer conducts his own music, one gets this. So it obviously reflects his complete sympathy with Elgar. It was as if the composer himself was reliving that music, recreating it. He knew how to lead. You see, the worst thing is to have a conductor who follows a dancer. He did the following at the rehearsals, and he understood everything by the time the performance came. So the dancers knew they were safe and could concentrate on their roles. It's this wonderful blend of music and dance. When it happens in the theatre, it is due to the conductor, and it doesn't happen that often. Not this great coming together.
In spite of all the adulation, Boult became conscious in the early 20s that he was drifting without a definite goal. He was also convinced that the only way he could raise the standard of musical performance was by working with a permanent orchestra. A chance to do just that came while he was on holiday in America, when he was invited to become permanent conductor of the Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra. Almost simultaneously, he was offered the conductorship of the Birmingham Choral Society due to the sudden resignation of Henry Wood over lack of money and rehearsal time. Surprisingly, Boult opted for the Birmingham job. Faced with a rich American orchestra and an impecunious Birmingham choir, why did Adrian Boult choose the latter? I think probably it was the challenge. He had always been very well looked after, very well cushioned by his family, and with no financial difficulties. Perhaps he felt he needed a spur. His instinct paid off. Within a year, he became conductor of the City of Birmingham Orchestra as well as the Choral Society, and so had his first semi-permanent orchestra, which was disbanded each summer to save money. His time in Birmingham was very successful and confirmed his reputation as a musical crusader with children's concerts, cheap popular concerts, and a wide variety of 20th century music, much of it British. But there was one uncharacteristic and disastrous episode, again involving the music of Elgar. A proposed performance of The Dream of Gorontius, using reduced woodwind, again to save money, so infuriated the composer that all contact between the two men ceased abruptly, although in the end the extra players were paid for by Boult out of his own pocket. By the time the relationship was resumed 5 years later, Boult had moved on to an even bigger challenge. As director of music, Dr. Boult was first and foremost an administrator, responsible for BBC music policy. Actually conducting the orchestra was very much an extra job.
Sir John Reith, as he then was, told me that he didn't care whether I played the penny whistle or anything else. I was there to direct his music, and the orchestra was something quite different.
He started auditioning very soon, as soon as he got to Savoy Hill. By Easter, he'd got together about 70.
And while I was on my holiday, I was actually on the beach, and a messenger boy came down from the hotel with a telegram from Adrian saying, "You've got the job."
I remember at the end of the first season, Reith was kind enough to say that I had been pretty successful with the orchestra, and would I take it on as permanent conductor?
Sir Adrian loved the classics, and he taught himself the modern music, but he hadn't the same love for it, I think. And it required a lot of work, hard work, many hours on the new modern scores, especially the things, the Berg, things of that sort. When he did Wozzeck, he spent weeks and weeks. In fact, he took time off to learn the Wozzeck score.
This was not surprising, as at this time he was working around 12 hours a day and frequently 7 days a week.
We were expected to play. We had a contemporary concert every month, I think it was, and we did the first performances of most of the new works, Berg and, well, Schoenberg over here.
I can't remember the person who it was, but he said to Sir Adrian once, I don't like this piece very much. Sir Adrian said, you know, that benign sort of voice and stroking the moustache, saying, well, you know, I think if you could play it better, you'd like it better.
With the conductorship of the BBC Symphony Orchestra, Adrian Boult had achieved his ambition of working with a genuinely permanent orchestra, in fact, the first salaried orchestra in this country. But the attitude of the musical establishment of the day was less than favourable.
There was a good deal of jealousy, there's no doubt about that. And there was a push, a move, very forcibly sent to Savoy Hill, to the effect that the new orchestra, whatever it was and however fine it was, must never perform outside the studio. And Sir John Reith was suspicious about that, and of course the music department was naturally, didn't like that idea at all. And he collected a meeting of eminent conductors to advise him on this, and they all agreed in saying that unless that orchestra was allowed to play in Queen's Hall, it would certainly not keep its standard up, it would certainly not remain a good orchestra. In fact, the best people would all leave it. Mm-hmm. And so it was decided that a series of public symphony concerts was to be announced at once.
As director of music, Boult persuaded the BBC that his new orchestra must not only give public concerts, but should tour the provinces and even make some spectacular trips across the Channel. The continental concerts each involved a classic, a work associated with the host country, and a showpiece for the orchestra. The reception was tremendous, and double encores had to be played Wagner's Meistersinger Overture and The Ride of the Valkyrie.
They were all on the platform playing Blue Danube and all the Strauss waltzes. Sir Adrian in the middle of the crowd, all conducting, and that was quite amazing that we, I mean, a very young orchestra, should arrive there and be feted pretty well by the local symphony orchestra. It was wonderful.
At the same time, Adrian Boult had become an ambassador for the BBC by his visits abroad, which included a very successful trip to the United States. Once again, new music figured high on his list of priorities. The final accolade for conductor and orchestra was to become film stars, a somewhat reluctant involvement in a documentary film about the BBC called The Voice of Britain. Fortunately, some shots of his conducting Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, which were not used in the final film, have survived. Surely a pity that that is virtually the only piece of film of Sir Adrian conducting that exists of his pre-war work. Mind you, he would have said that's as it should be, because a conductor should be heard and not seen. In the 30s, on a more personal note, there were two very important events. Firstly, in 1933, he got married, the finest performance of my life, as he said. And then, 4 years later, he was knighted. At this time, it seems incredible to think that he was still doing what amounted to 2 full-time jobs, apart from his new domestic responsibilities, which included 4 stepchildren. It was not until 1942 that he finally gave up the administrative side, handing over the director of music post to his good friend Arthur Bliss. His conducting immediately achieved a new high. An official BBC report described his conducting as like Toscanini at his best. The old order at the BBC was changing. Lord Reith had left in 1938, and gradually there built up an anti-Boult faction in the organisation. In early 1948, the corporation appointed a new director of music, Stuart Wilson, former husband of Anne Wilson, now Lady Boult. On the 26th of May, he stated officially that his first priority was to plan for the future of the symphony orchestra, gradually replacing Boult. The excuse was that April the 8th, 1949, was Sir Adrian's 60th birthday, the official retirement age for BBC staff. But Lord Reith had intended otherwise.
Lord Reith had said to him, and I heard this said, "We shall never sack you. You've done a splendid job. When you get to 60, we'll draw up a different kind of contract, and as you get older, you must ask for all the help you need, but you must never leave us." But when Sir Adrian was 60, by that time, Lord Reith had gone to other work. There was a different Director General, and he felt that rules must be kept. The orchestra went in a deputation to him to plead with him to reconsider his decision, but he didn't. And Sir Adrian was broken-hearted. He really was. The orchestra was like his child. He'd made it. He knew everyone. He knew their wives and families. And when they were ill, he visited them in hospital.
Well, we were all upset because it was a very sudden retirement, 60. I mean, it was a ridiculous age to retire.
He always said when I was sacked by the BBC. He never said when I retired. I remember sitting with him on the box in Studio 1 in Maida Vale when the orchestra had gone. You know, we were sitting down on the floor on the rostrum. And he really poured it all out. He told me how upset he was and felt terrible about it. And this was not the stiff English gentleman at all. It was a really deeply hurt human being.
He'd given his life to that orchestra. It had been the greatest thing in British music when it began in 1930, when all the great conductors came, and he had done extraordinary programs with them, lots and lots of new music, and it was, in fact, something of which everybody in Britain was proud. And I think he felt so identified with that he couldn't believe that just because he was 60, he had to be dismissed. And I sympathize with him there. I don't think that was perhaps very cleverly managed.
And he dreaded being out of work, I think, but he wasn't for long. He came away from Maida Vale one Friday afternoon, and on Monday morning he started with the London Philharmonic.
When he left the BBC and joined the London Philharmonic, he was again working with a permanent orchestra. He never liked freelance work. He preferred, as he said, to say fresh things to the same people rather than saying the same old things to new people. This new phase of his career is the one by which most people know him. He went back into the recording studio and began a long series of recordings, most of which are still available today.
I didn't record many things with him that he hadn't done many, many times in concert. In fact, it was most awe-inspiring to look in the flyleaf of the score. And there would be written down all the performances he'd done going back to sort of 1930-something or even earlier. I'm sure he did prepare. He would sit for hours looking at the score, but he could have equally walked straight into the studio. On one occasion, we did Brahms' symphony without his having expected to do it. We were finishing a Vaughan Williams piece with, I think, the LSO, and we decided we had some spare time, and I said, what would you like to do? Let's do something which isn't English. And he said, well, I'd love to do a Brahms symphony.
I happened to drop in at EMI when they were recording one of them, I think number 2, and he simply got up and said, well, you know this, gentlemen, don't you? And the red light went on and let them play it. And I think because of the extraordinary liberation that an orchestra feels at being allowed to use their own judgment, it was absolutely beautiful.
He liked very long takes. That was the great advantage, that he would always go and rehearse a whole movement. And when he'd done that, he would come back and listen to it, and then go back, perhaps do it once more, and perhaps listen to that again. And that was it. He would then expect me to tell him what bits needed doing again, or sometimes, of course, he would say, I think we should do this, that, or the other bit again. And we would always do little patches. He was never one of these, 4 steps forward, 3 steps back conductors, many of whom do make records which sound all right in the end, but the recording was always made like a concert. His feeling for architecture really was the greatest strength. He knew all the music he conducted extremely well. Even pieces he learnt late in life, he always knew them back to front. And he could see the last bar from the first.
There was enormous flexibility inside a bar, inside a section, inside the whole world, inside the whole work. There was flexibility, but precision and structural control. It was as if he had, like a great piece of sculpture in his mind, in stasis, the whole work set hard.
I think modern performance seems to put too much light on every detail and not enough attention to the rise and fall of the movement as a whole. I believe there's a reference somewhere in one of Mozart's letters to the fact that he claimed that he could feel, apprehend a symphony in one moment, that he'd not got to wait for the 30 minutes for the music to flow past him, but that it was all there in his mind straight away as one single entity. And that's what I mean about the architectural side of music. And I feel with greatest deference that some of my greatest colleagues now, younger colleagues as conductors, not only conductors, but some other instrumentalists too, think altogether too much about the detail and to behave, in fact, as if the skipper of a ship was down in his engine room with an oil can instead of standing on his bridge and controlling affairs.
Oh, stop. You know, people, you are getting worse and worse. You don't pay slightest attention. You go on playing, you talk like market women half the time. It's only because I happen to be able to shout you down that I do. Now then, once more, first and second. 1.
I feel that the conductor's job had just got quite a big enough job to put the sense of the music across the players he's working with. And the rest of it, the audience can take the sound of the playing.
Of the surviving television recordings of Adrian Boult at work, 2 happened to be of the same piece, the Beethoven Violin Concerto. He recorded one with David Oistrakh and the London Symphony Orchestra in 1968 at the Albert Hall, the second version 4 years later with Nathan Milstein and the London Philharmonic Orchestra at the Festival Hall. So, We have two very distinguished soloists from very different backgrounds, two different orchestras, and even two different locations. In fact, apart from the piece of music, the only common factor is the conductor. Yet the two recordings remain synchronized with one another for long passages.
Concerned about getting the tempo right. He wasn't dogmatic about tempo. He didn't say there is a correct tempo for every piece, but the tempo that really worked was the one that counted at that moment, according to what he sensed the orchestra felt like, what the acoustics were like. That was very important. If the acoustics were very reverberant, then obviously you couldn't take it too fast. And he wasn't dogmatic about it. He always tried to adjust to the situation.
We were doing the fire music, and there's very nasty harp part in that. And I said to him after, I said, you know, Sir Adrian, you're playing this dreadfully fast. Yeah. I said, don't you remember we played this under Siegfried Wagner? And he said, oh, he said, did he play it slower? I said, very much slower. I said, we could play every note then.
I've said exactly the same thing to him. I said, you know, you did it faster, or you did it slower.
Yeah.
Did I? I
was
said,
never
yes,
really
you did.
quite sure.
Well, I said, well, I can remember all right, because it's physical when you do it.
Exactly.
His lack of histrionics, of course, led people to consider, superficially, that he was a dull conductor. He rather enjoyed this at times, and I remember him telling me a lovely story about being on the jury of a conductor's competition at Liverpool. He said that when all the conductors had worked and the jury met, he'd got a train to catch to get back for a rehearsal in London. And he said, well, I'll set the ball rolling. I thought the American was the best conductor. Whereupon several members of the jury exploded and said, the American? Oh, but Sir Adrian, he was so dull. Ah, perhaps that's why I like him. Everybody knows I'm a dull conductor.
He had this tremendous assurance when he got onto the rostrum. You knew it was all going to be right. And I think he knew the music back to front, and he knew exactly where it was all going.
He was the ideal radio conductor. Perfect. He would do absolutely anything, and not merely as a sort of a routine, casual job, but he would take great trouble over it and try to get it absolutely right.
The outstanding great feature of Boult's conducting, in my opinion, was his ability as an accompanist. He was absolutely, I think, unequalled by any of them in that respect.
Boult was the master, I think, really. Who are the others? Well, I don't think they are so thoroughly a musician that Boult was.
The thing that struck me about him was to lay out the score in the clearest possible way and not get in the way of it yourself. That is why I'm so grateful to have heard all the classics, because he presented them simply, with great authority, but he didn't interfere with them.
He was international. It's just that he happened to have been born in the British Isles and have a moustache which belonged to that period, and was very tall and very noble to look at, And so people thought he was a musical Colonel Blimp. But the naughty boy inside him, the capricious little boy who belonged to the entire world, was the real Adrian.
I think that he could have had any international career he wanted had he gone after it. But he didn't like it. He didn't like to travel. He didn't want to go anywhere. So he quite consciously, I think, opted to just make music in his own land. And I think had he carried on running about the world the way all of us in our demented way do, he would have been a household word everywhere.
For me, of course, he was amongst the very greatest conductors. Indeed, amongst the very greatest of artists, because all his principles apply equally to all arts, not just conducting. He felt that music was to be constantly discovered, not the possession of any particular musician or conductor, player, soloist. When we were sharing a conducting class once in the Royal College of Music, a student said about a conductor that Boult had described, but he hadn't your technique, Sir Adrian. Sir Adrian snapped back, "It's not my technique, it's available to anyone." He also used to say, along the same line, that he didn't like to hear conductors talking about their Brahms or their Sibelius. Don't they realize that if they're knocked over by a bus today, Sibelius and Brahms remain tomorrow? And presumably Elgar.
Am I really conscious of God and of being God's direct servant in forging patterns for earth? Sometimes I seem to be asleep to the greatness of my calling and task. I am asleep to so much beauty around me. I just do not see it, to notice it, or to feed on it. When I touch the clouds, they break into 1,000 rays and shed light which no one can fail to see. But I could do it every time, and I must by perfect intensity. I must give my whole self in the greatest dedication of all time consciously. Making pictures and patterns of the notes is not enough. Knowing the composer's mind is not enough. I must pull down the ultimate beauty and truth of music as God's imagination for healing and peace of mankind through myself to people on earth.